Welcome to this book launch. It's very good to have you. Thank you. I know some of you have come quite a distance to be here today, so we're very grateful to you for doing that. I'm Michael Lloyd. I'm the principal here at Wycliffe Hall. So if you heard that Wycliffe's a completely unprincipled organisation, it's not true. We have one. Unfortunately, that's me. Richard did me the honour of asking if I would just say a few words at the beginning. If you look up Richard McCallum on Amazon, the first thing you come across is a box set of McCallum Complete Series 1 and 2, which I have to confess I'd not heard of. So I read further, and it says, "From deep within the morgue at St Patrick's Hospital." And I thought probably, this is probably the wrong so I looked elsewhere, and actually, of course, it's Richard McCallum, the sociologist we're meeting with today. You are a sociologist, really.
I don't know, you need to ask Grace about that, really.
Yes. Well, I looked up sociologists too, and the thing that came to me was, if you cross a sociologist, what do you get if you cross a sociologist and a mafia boss? And the answer is apparently an offer you can't understand, which is very unfair to mafia bosses. No, very unfair social. And I think what I wanted to say was that Richard is the sort of sociologist, not only that you can understand, but that helps you to understand others. It's the kind that helps, by observation and mutual interaction, different groupings to understand each other. And that's why I'm so excited about the book that we're launching and celebrating today. It's a way of trying to, different groupings, trying to understand each other better in a way that makes for enhanced pursuit of truth and enhanced community and collaboration. So it's a delight to be able to commend this book and to celebrate its launch. And who's going to speak? Are you, Martin? Would you please welcome Martin to come and give the first...
I really don't deserve any applause, I'm just chairing. Thank you, Michael. And I'm going to wear these clothes more often because several people have said, "Are you the principal here?" So watch out. You know? Anyway, I've just been asked to say a very quick word about the Centre for those who may not be so familiar with it. I'm Martin Whittingham. I'm Academic Dean at the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies. So I've worked with Richard for the last 10 or 11 years. So what's the Centre about? And then I'll just say a little bit about where we're heading in the next hour or so. So some of you will know this, but we exist to encourage the serious study of Christian-Muslim relations and mutual perceptions and share traditions, scriptures, and so forth. Think hard, relate well is a shorter way of putting that. That's what we try to do. We try to encourage Muslims and Christians to come together for respectful, honest, serious discussion. How do we do that? Various ways. We have a residential summer school for a week each August. We have seminars, research seminars, monthly Quran and Bible study group, which you're welcome to if you're interested to know more about that. And we teach in various settings. So Richard does some teaching here, in university and elsewhere we teach. And then we write in various forms, short form and also sometimes weighty tomes like today's offering. So I'll just also give you a brief idea of where we're heading. In a few moments, Richard will come and tell us a little bit about the book, and then we're very pleased that Richard's original PhD supervisor, Professor Grace Davie, will come and talk a little bit about the wider context for work like this. And we're also very pleased to have Shenaz Bunglawala here, Director of the Christian Muslim Forum. I'll introduce her later, and then also your very own, those of you who are on home turf here, Dr Andrew Atherstone, who's a tutor here at Wycliffe Hall. And after that, we'll have some time for questions, and we're going to do all that in about an hour. So let's see how we go. So, Richard, over to you. Thank you very much.
thank you, Martin, and thank you, Michael, and to Wycliffe Hall for hosting the book launch, and I'm very grateful to you for that. And I want to thank the Solomon Academic Trust as well, which is the charity behind the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies. I'm delighted that Mark Oxborough, our chair, is here this evening, and I want to particularly thank them because about 18 months ago they granted me a sabbatical for me to be able to finish this book off. I raised the money to cover the sabbatical, but I am very grateful for you for doing that. So just a little bit about the background to where the book came from. I spent 10 years living in Tunisia in North Africa, Muslim country. Went there very early 90s. When we left to go there, nobody in this country was particularly interested in Islam and Muslims, but discovered that when we came back 10 years later, everybody was interested in Islam and Muslims, sadly because of 9/11. And when we came back, I was asked to speak at churches and conferences about Islam and understanding Muslims. And as I was doing that, I was listening to other speakers, other Christians who were educating Christian audiences about Islam and Muslims. And I was quite concerned with what I was hearing. There was a lot of variety and diversity. Some Christians were reaching out in friendship and trying to understand Islam and Muslims. Others had a much different approach. And I remember one day I was at a very large Christian conference in a tent in a field, hundreds of Christians in the audience, and the speaker was talking about Islam, but then also talking about Muslims who are coming into our space, and we have to stand up and protect our space. And he was talking about the history of British colonialism and everything that we've done for the world. And as he was beginning to get into his theme, he was getting standing ovations from this white middle-class Christian audience. I'd never heard anything quite like it. It was quite sort of primordial. The ogre is coming. We have to reach for the pitchforks and protect ourselves. And just at the end, an Anglican clergyman who I later met, a lovely guy, worked in South Birmingham, stood up and asked a question from the microphone. He said, "Aren't you in danger of stirring up racial hatred with this sort of talk?" And the audience were booing the clergyman and telling him to sit down. I mean, I just never heard this. And I thought, wow, what's going on? And that's when I decided that I wanted to do a bit more thinking. I decided I would do some doctoral research, and I was absolutely privileged to find Grace in the University of Exeter, and she agreed to take me on as somebody with an eclectic academic background, I think was how you put it, Grace. And it was just a wonderful 4 years that I spent thinking through some of these issues alongside Grace and others. And so it was, that was a long time ago, wasn't it, that I actually finished the PhD, and now, many, many years later, some of the fruit of it has come in this book, Evangelical Christian Responses to Islam. And it's looking at evangelicals, partly because that's my background in the Christian community, but partly because it's a group that sociologists are very interested in, because it's sort of a more vibrant, maybe growing part of the Christian community. Put that alongside Muslims, and what do you get? You get a really interesting sociological project. So I discovered actually that people were quite interested in what I was doing. And when I was doing the title for my PhD, I tacked onto it, "In the Public Sphere," because I sort of felt my title didn't have enough gravitas at the beginning. And then Grace asked me what the public sphere was, and I said I had absolutely no clue. And I went away and did some reading and discovered it was a big hairy thing. I mean, it's a do. And discovered all sorts of theorists who talked about what the public sphere is and how it creates public opinion, how it brings little groups together around particular issues, it circulates texts. And so, in actual fact, the sociological academic background in this book was what I called a religious micro-public sphere amongst evangelicals that was interested in talking about this issue of Islam and the texts that they circulate, the books they write, the articles they put in magazines, what they put on their websites, and so many different things. And so this book begins to paint a picture of what that micro-religious public sphere for Islam might look like amongst evangelicals. And in the chapters, in part 2, I open up different questions that evangelicals are grappling with to do with Islam, from who is Allah, who is Muhammad, what about the Quran, through what about Sharia in society, right to Israel, Palestine, very contentious issues, what is Islam? And then in the final part of the book, I look at how are evangelicals approaching Muslims? How are they talking to them? Are they dialoguing? Are they doing apologetics, defending the faith? Are they doing polemics and attacking the faith? And discovering again that there's a lot of diversity, controversy within the evangelical community about how these things are talked about. So I just wanted to mention, though, that because this book is it's a tad pricey at the moment, I have to admit it, that there is a website that goes along beside it, christianresponses-to-islam.com. And if you go on my website, you can find chapter summaries, all sorts of information. I've also done short videos just to tell you about each chapter. So you can watch a dynamic graphic with audio backing, just explaining each of those chapters. And then also I've created a database out of my bibliography. I have over 400 books and other things that have been produced mainly by evangelicals, but I'm beginning to expand it to other Christian traditions now. And you can go on here and you can search by different themes and topics within the the literature around evangelical responses to Islam. So I encourage you to go and check that out. Of course, I do want you to buy the book, and there is a special discount code that you can go onto the Bloomsbury website, and if you put in this code, and I have some flyers over on the table that you can pick up, and it will give you the code. If you click on the link, you'll actually get to one of Cardinal Ratzinger's books, which, well, there you go, I don't know. I'm in elevated company, but you can pop in the discount code, and I do hope in a few months that there will be a paperback version. Just before I hand over to Grace, just one story. When this was published back in February, something very interesting happened. I was part of a WhatsApp group of people who were discussing Islam, Christians who were discussing Islam in this country, all sorts of different aspects of it. And this WhatsApp group, just maybe a week after the book came out, became so heated and intemperate, so personal in its interaction that they had to shut the WhatsApp group down. And as I was reflecting on that, I was just remembering the last paragraph of my book raises the question of whether the religious public sphere amongst evangelicals that's discussing Islam, whether that public sphere will be strong enough to carry the debate, the controversy, the discussion that has to happen between evangelicals if they are really to understand Islam and Muslims amongst us and live together well. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor Grace Davie to you. Grace was a very gracious PhD supervisor for somebody who was not a sociologist when I started, and she kept saying, you have to think sociologically. And I said, I do not understand what that means. Grace is going to come and help us think a little bit about what it means to think sociologically about religion today. Oh, sorry, the clicker.
Richard is more technically minded than I am. I might be more sociologically minded than he is, but thank you. I don't use this.
Just right. You don't.
Hang on. Yeah.
That was me thinking she wanted one.
Good afternoon or good evening, wherever we are, and thank you so much for this invitation. Delighted to see Richard again and family and to be with you. I don't think I've ever been to Wycliffe before, so that's a first, and I'm very pleased to see so many of you. I'm going to do work on what I know about, which is about the context of the debate that Richard and Shenaz and Andrew will be developing. So I'm sticking to the bits I know. I wonder, I'm just curious about this. How many of you know Thomas Halleck? One. Right, I'll tell you just a wee bit about Thomas. More of you should. Thomas Halleck is a very interesting man. He's a Czech priest who was ordained before 1989 clandestinely in Germany. He went to Erfurt. He was very close to Wycliffe Hall. He's a very interesting man. I've not long ago been to Prague and spent a little bit of time with him, and I find him inspirational. So I'm starting with this book called The Afternoon of Christianity. I do recommend it. I mean, not as much as Richard's book, but a close second this afternoon. And he gave me my way in. And let's go to the second quote, because I don't want to read them all, but they sort of say the same thing in different ways. And what he says to us about questions about God and the essence of man repeatedly demand plausible, meaningful, and intelligible answers in the context of a particular culture and historical situation. Now, this doesn't mean there's no truth. It means that the truth is heard differently in different contexts. And I think we just got to accept that. So we're going to work on the context in which we are and how we hear truth and in which the debate is taking place. I don't think you can say anything about Thomas Halleck being anything but a very courageous Christian, given his background. He's Catholic. He's not really one of the hierarchy. He's more of a prophet. But I do find his work well worth thinking about. It's not changing, Richard. What have I done?
No, nothing, probably. Oops. Right, try going next.
Right. So it's, once you get into the context, of course, your problems are beginning, not ending. Now, this is our current spiritual situation, as described by him, variously described as a decline of religion, we hear that, a crisis of faith, or of the church, we hear that, a religious and spiritual renaissance, we hear that too, a return of religion, you hear that, a transformation of religion into spirituality, or, at the same time, into ideologies of political identity. A pluralization of religion or individualization of faith, or an opportunity for new evangelization. So this is not only a contradictory and a complex story, but it's a continually evolving one. I mean, Richard gave us hints to that. He went to Tunis, nobody was talking about Christians and Muslims. He came home, everybody was. He kicks off from 9/11. Since then, the 7th of October rings in our minds as a very pivotal moment. Things will never be the same again. We know that. So we've got to keep on going. We can't just stop and do it once. I often read people who've nailed it. Never. They're wrong if they think they've nailed it. So how can we make sense of it? And I will talk mostly about Europe. Do come in if you want to. How can we make sense of it? I'll talk mostly about Europe because that's what I know best. And I see Britain, the UK, England, wherever you want to focus, as part of the European pattern. I will refer a little bit to the US as well, because Richard said I would on the piece of paper. Now there's two slides. This is the first one and the one following it, which are key. This is Religion in Modern Europe 1, and this is where I was about the time of the millennium. I published the article in 2006, I can give you the reference, and it was just simply called Religion in Modern Europe, the factors to take into account. And what you do is kind of build the model. Now, underneath everything else in Europe, in Oxford, in Exeter, where I live, in the Czech Republic, in Russia too, you have a cultural heritage, which I usually focus on time and space. Now, those are pretty basic categories within which we live, and we live within Christian time. Sunday is our day of rest, my students used to find that quite a wake-up call. They didn't really quite know why Sunday was different. I mean, that shows you how secular we've become. They did know about Christmas and Easter, mostly about eggs on chocolate. They rarely knew about Pentecost. though they did recognise Whit Sunday, at least my age would, younger people wouldn't, because we've now gone to Maybank holiday. And space, and this is the way I capture this, is if you go to any European city and you arrive in the dark, I love doing this, you're shown to your hotel, and in the morning you pull the curtains. Now you may just see nothing except a wall, but if you're lucky and you can see over the city, you will see Christian churches. This is our skyline. We mostly take it for granted until it's disturbed, and then quite a lot of people get agitated. It's changing. That's our background. Look at the town planning of any European city, and you can work through this. And you can ask where the money came from, why the churches are there, and all sorts of things on space. And now, overlaying that, or the next move up, is vicarious religion. Now, I thought of that term, and it means the kind of churches that do things on behalf of larger numbers of people. It's a parish model, it's a territorial model in Europe, it's an inherited model. It's a public utility. It's there at the point of need for those who live in a particular area. It's collapsing. I rather like this model. I think it's got a lot going for it, but it's terribly expensive, like the National Health Service. The parallels are quite close. Vicarious, of course, if you're doing it on behalf of something, it's halfway to precarious. I think they're quite related. And that, I think, is where you see the focus of secularization. It's crumbling. It holds up well in Poland. It's collapsed completely in the Czech Republic. They're neighbours, they're quite different. And if I were to have a longer, we could go through different parts of Europe and see the different ways in which this is extant or not. But over the top of that is growing a new model, which is much more like a market. And this is one that you don't choose to leave, but you choose to join. And you see all sorts of different kinds of churches. I mean, it began at the time of the Reformation, because in Britain, for example, you had you were choosing something different in countries where the Reformation took root. And it had precursors too. And this market has gainers and losers, like all markets. So, and the two run side by side, not always very happily. And I think evangelicals are quite interesting in this country because they lie across it. Because you have evangelicals within the historic church, and you have evangelicals in a mass of free churches. So you kind of experience both. I'm quite wedded to the former. Maybe many of you prefer the latter. Not good or bad, just different, and we need to recognise we have different embeddings. This market is extending because of migration. Do you remember that many, many Christians arrive in our country? It's not only people of other faiths. Many, many Christians come into this country, and they extend this market almost infinitely. So the choices become much more diverse and include other faiths as well as Christians. And if you were to look, if I start, say, around the millennium, well, no, I'm going to go back further. There's 3 waves in 2006. There's still 3 waves. The first was the post-war, and that's France, Britain, what was then West Germany and the Netherlands, all looking for labour in their former colonies. In the 1990s, this extended to other European societies. So this is the moment when Greece, Italy, to extent Spain and Portugal and Ireland flip from being countries of emigration to countries of immigration almost overnight. So Dublin starts to be a hip place to go for stag do's instead of a bit of a dump. Okay? I hope nobody's Irish here.
Not now.
And the third wave was 2004, when the enlargement of the European Union, when lots of people came from East Europe to the West. That's when all our Polish builders and plumbers came. They've all gone home just when we needed them most. And that altered our religious profile. 1 million Catholics arrived. 1 million Poles arrived. Now that's a lot. Big change in the Catholic community. And the secular reactions were there. Both the nuns, the people who choose to have no faith, or to stand outside the churches altogether, they're not coterminous, those. Lots of people who leave the churches still have faith, or something towards faith. And strong secular reactions. New atheists, this is the moment of the new atheists. And an awareness that patterns of religion emerge in Europe, including the UK, are an exception in global terms. We tended to think, we still do, that what Europe did today, everyone else did tomorrow. That's wrong, but the theories, the thinking in my discipline was very Europe-based, and it didn't fit the global situation at all well. I did lots of work on this. I presented this kind of material at umpteen diocesan conferences, and in the church, beyond the church, in academia. It was very interesting, and most people found it helpful because it joined up the dots of things they knew already. Let's see if it does it. No, it doesn't.
This one.
Oh, sorry, but it was that one last time. Make it do it.
Right, try again.
Right, okay. Now, fast forward, because we haven't got a lot of time, 20 years now, okay? What's changed? And the thing I think I most want to bring to your attention is I did not anticipate these changes. It's not what I thought was going to happen. Cultural heritage is still there, but the skyline is altering quite fast in some parts of our major cities. You see, I can't quite see the mosque in Exeter outside from my window, but quite a lot of people say, I say turn left by the mosque, and they say the mosque. You know, they didn't expect to find a mosque. And Exeter doesn't have a long-term Muslim community because it didn't have the kind of industry that invited such labour. Time and space. Time is a problem. If we work on 5-day weeks and weekends, and Sunday is a different sort of day, now not everybody who arrives has that rhythm. And that can be difficult. If you're an Orthodox Jew, it's very hard to work in that system. So, time is, you're aware of the tensions now. Now, vicarious religion, and this really did take me by surprise. Here, and I find it in the literature about populism, and I'm annoyed by it because it's not what I meant by vicarious religion, but the toothpaste was out of the tube, bad luck, it's just taken up. And it's a particular kind of Christian, or they would style themselves as Christian, often those who have an allegiance to the historic church but are losing the Christian narrative. So it's becoming identity-focused rather than a belief system. And that, I think, is a very dangerous situation. Because this is to do with identity rather than commitment, exclusion rather than inclusion. Now, a parish church at its best is wonderfully inclusive. It is a focus. You often see it in rural areas, but you can still see it you also see it in cities. I am proud to be part of a parish like this, when all kinds of people come into the church for all kinds of reasons, and they are welcome. But when you are not one of us if you are not Lutheran, you are not one of us if you are not Christian. That is a turning of this into an identity to with the intention of excluding mostly Muslims, not only Muslims, but that's where the focus is. And you see it very much in the Nordic countries, in the Lutheran churches in the northern Nordic countries, which I thought were super tolerant. You see it in the Netherlands. You could see a kind of it in France, but it's turned to the alter ego of Catholicism, which is laïcité, which is secularism. So it's quite complex in France, but I think the same thing is happening. And it's a real wake-up call to me, is what happens to people who maintain an identity and lose their theology, or lose what Weber called an ethic. Not a good situation. And that's populism. And it's the church either willingly colluding or being exploited. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. Sometimes it goes along with ideas about familism and more children of a certain kind. So these are sort of bunched issues. The literature's growing fast. It's not very reassuring. So the market is still there. That's ever extending. I'm not going to say much more about that because it's not caught my attention in the way that this shift in vicarious religion had. And the new arrivals, there's another wave starting in 2015. This was after the Syrian war. And this is the one that's causing a lot of controversy now. That small boats, we can't stop them. It's all over Europe. All of Europe is anxious about this. I think you have to remember the war in Syria. I think you also have to remember climate change, which was already mentioned. You also have to remember, this is not going to go away, demographic change in Europe. Our birth rates are falling fast. We need the labour. This is all happening at once. And then the secular alternatives, the reactions come. Again, the nuns are growing rapidly in their diversity, considerably diverse, and the secular reactions are shifting in ways that astonish me. Richard Dawkins styles himself a cultural Christian. Now, I did not think that was going to happen. I really didn't. Hirsi Ali converts. What's happening? I think Richard Dawkins is a cultural Christian because he doesn't like Islam. Sorry, but I'm afraid that's what's happened. It's again an example of somebody who's taking the shell without the belief. It's not reassuring. And I would shift just a tiny bit on my bottom line that there is an awareness that the patterns of religion that emerge in Europe, I'm not using exceptional anymore, I'm using distinctive. Because it's not exceptional to one other thing. There's all kinds of patterns across different parts of the globe, and we are only one of them. So we still have to be very cautious about generalisation, but I've changed it a little bit in how I think of the rest. It's not one other. It's very diverse things. Nearly done. Contradictory pressures, more than one thing happening at once. Secularisation is growing steadily. It's not reversing. But so too is religious diversity, driven by immigration, which will not stop. I don't care what the politicians say. It won't go away. Why do they think they're going to stay in France? France has got exactly the same problems we have. Secularisation leads to eroding practice and eroding belief, and inability to comprehend what it means to be religious. Open any newspaper and you'll discover that. At the same time, growing religious diversity prompts a return of religion to the public sphere, not to private life. When I started sociology, secularisation meant religion drained from the public life, retained in the personal sphere. It's draining from the personal sphere now and returning to public life. All my colleagues in IR are into religion. What happens? An ill-informed and ill-mannered debate, which Richard is going to put right. That's the whole point of his book. That's why I feel so strongly about it. That's exactly the kind of book we need. We need, and the work that you're just talking about, think hard and relate well. We've all got to do this. It's urgent. Do it well. There we've got the cultural Christians again. I said that at an earlier stage. The marked rise in populism, of course, is militating against the good debate. It's often associated with conservative, intolerant forms of religion, understood in terms of identity rather than belief or practice, in which the goal is exclusion rather than inclusion. Now, I really do commend Richard's book. I want to hear what the specialists say about it, because I think it just answers the need for a better, constructive, informed, generous, welcoming debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much. And if you want to read more of the kind of thinking that Professor Davie's been talking about, she's the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Religion in Europe. And I think it's really helpful having the specific focus of Richard's book, but also some wider thinking brought together. So, enough from me. Our next speaker is Shenaz Bunglawala, who, as I said, is director of the Christian Muslim Forum and a trustee of the Muslim Institute, and also writes various things, but she said don't weary people with that. So.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Richard, first of all, for loaning me your book. It's been a marvellous read. I've enjoyed it very much indeed, and also for inviting me here this afternoon. It's also my first time here, or was the other seminar that I did a couple of years ago in the same place? Yeah, I thought so. Right, so my comments are confined largely to the book, and I'm going to say a little bit about some of the content, and then I'm hoping to move on to say a little bit about where I think the book opens up space for further conversation and some of the challenges that the book presents both to evangelicals and also to Muslims. So, I mean, first of all, the book is marvellous. I can't say enough good things about it. I'm reading it from a Muslim perspective, and as I read it, I'm enamoured of the breadth of information that it covers in terms of evangelical Christians, and it's not confined to the UK in terms of space. It is a global overview. There is a lot of information about members of the evangelical community that operate in spaces where Muslims live as minorities, but also in Muslim-majority countries. And I think the coupling of those diverse contexts is a really interesting dynamic in the book itself. It's accessibly written. It's a really easy read. I mean, Richard is an academic, and I know people may say disparaging things about sociologists, not just sociologists, social scientists in general. It can often be difficult to read academic texts. They can be quite dense, they can be jargon-laden, but this book is not one of them. It's very accessibly written. I think the concepts and the ideas that are translated in the book, the way that Richard uses this notion of the micro-public sphere, both to locate evangelical voices and evangelical writings, but also to situate that micro-public sphere within a wider context of conversations about Islam and Muslims among Christians in general, and then in relation to macro conversations. I think the conceptual tools that I use are really, really fascinating. And the dyadic formulations that Richard presents in the book of open and closed ways of talking about Islam and talking about Muslims and talking about Muhammad or the Quran. Those dyadic formulations help you appreciate the spectrum of positions that evangelicals occupy when it comes to these subjects. I think the focus on particular aspects of Islam has been really well put together, asking, what is it that evangelicals understand when Muslims invoke Allah? Is it the same God? Are they talking about God in the Old Testament? Are they talking about God in the New Testament? Do we think of, do we relate to the character of God in the same way? Do evangelicals see this in Muslims when they're looking at Muslims as people of Abrahamic religion? Chapters that cover the Quran, the Hadith, subjects around socio-political issues like violence, Islamophobia, Sharia, Islamization, and of course Israel-Palestine, which is a really topical issue now. I think writing this book in an exhaustive way would have been really difficult. I mean, the breadth of information that Richard has covered is absolutely spectacular, but it's no less encapsulating of just how much variance there is in evangelical responses to Islam, and I really appreciated just how much information is contained. It's given me an insight into navigating terrain that I would have been completely unfamiliar with had I not read this particular book. And I think Richard setting out that evangelical communities are the growing trends within Christian communities makes it all the more necessary that we shine a light on some of the things that are occurring in the evangelical microsphere. And the reason I say it is because the microsphere isn't confined to the microsphere. I say a little bit that what I really appreciated about the book was how deeply embedded it is in Christian conviction. Because I think it makes it easy for Muslims reading the book to appreciate authenticity in terms of evangelical responses. Is that, these are evangelicals speaking for themselves about how they think about Muslims, how they think about Muslims in their presence, how they think about Muslims that live far away from them, how it is that they think about Muslims living alongside them. Is this encroachment? Is it invasion? Is it accommodation? Is it a confluence of some of those things? I think the positionality that Richard adopts in terms of surveying evangelical responses to Islam make it really easy from a Muslim reader's perspective actually to appreciate Christian orientations on these sorts of things. I was really pleased to read that you cited the Christian Muslim Forum Ethical Guidelines on bearing witness. I think that's I was really pleased to it because a lot of what the book presents are opportunities and challenges for further dialogue, and each of the chapters, when you read the book, ends with points of discussion. Is once we've reviewed all of this, where do we go from here? Where do Muslims go from here? Where do Christians go from here? What I would say in terms of areas where I felt the book opens up new conversations are, for example, are micro-public spheres subject to the same level of scrutiny and regulation? So reading the book, I have a familiarity with what the evangelical micro-public sphere looks like. I've got a familiarity now with many of the main players in some of these debates, subject and context specific, for example. But I'm also minded when I read the book that if some of the things that come across in terms of evangelical orientations and positions on subjects related to Muslims were reversed, and if Muslims were saying these things about Christians, would we still look at that micro-public sphere and question whether or not it was civil, question whether or not it was well regulated, and question whether or not there is an illusion to hate speech and other things? I'm mindful, obviously, because Muslims get a really bad rap about things like fundamental British values and about integration into the UK and about extremism. And, some of you may not be familiar, sociologists I hope will be familiar, with definitions of extremism and the new definition of extremism the government has introduced recently. When it comes to shaping our civil discourse, are micro-public spheres immune to the regulation of that civility? Do they evade it because they micro? When I was reading the book, I was mindful of the contrast between this particular public sphere, micro-public sphere, the evangelical space, and Muslim content that might proliferate in a different micro-public sphere, but which may get treated quite differently. And I think that disparity of treatment opens up a really interesting area of conversation. Another aspect that struck me when reading the book was in relation to the CMF guidelines. And CMF guidelines, if I read out one of them, one of the aspects of the guidelines refer to speaking about our faith without demeaning or ridiculing the faith of others. And it's a really important aspect of the ethical guidelines in CMF, is that when we're conducting dialogue between Muslims and Christians, that we're careful not to be disparaging of the other, that we're careful to be respectful, however it is that the other may present themselves, may express themselves, may articulate themselves. We will show due respect to the way that they do that. And one of the things that comes out in the book, one of the nodes in the matrix of that micro-public sphere are those who are designated as former believers, people who once were Muslims but who converted to Christianity, and the utilization of their particular positionality in terms of directing, engaging, and participating in the micro-public sphere. And I was struck by the question that when you privilege people who are considered former, do you distort views of those who remain in the religion? And this comes across quite a bit in the book, particularly among those formers who have quite strident views about their former religion. Does that stridency then colour the way that we will then think about people who remain in that religion? And what is the impact of that distortion, both in the microsphere but also in the areas where the microsphere elides into the macro-public sphere? I question whether or not micro-public spheres risk the danger of becoming echo chambers. There is an aspect of the book where you notice the strength of debate within evangelical circles. But does that strength of debate simply allow permission to continue with that stridency within, without really looking for corrective mechanisms from without that might introduce new light, new information? Is there a danger that we end up embedding prejudice without opening space for dialogue through external lenses? And I would also say a point of concern would be where the elision of the micro and the macro public spheres lead to contention on issues of socio-political importance. So it's not detailed in the book, but I've been involved in British Muslim communities long enough. I like to think that that I look younger than I am, but certainly knowledge of it. When I was reading the book, there were so many instances where I remembered where the antagonism between Christians and Muslims occurred on a particular policy issue. But it's only now retrospectively that I'm able to locate it in the evangelical micro-public sphere. So issues around, for example, incitement to religious hatred legislation, which was a huge battle for Muslim communities in the early noughties. It was an attempt by the early Blair governments in 2001 and 2004 to introduce this piece of legislation, which finally got passed in 2005, was enacted under royal assent in 2006. But the vociferous debate around incitement to religious hatred and whether or not by introducing this particular piece of legislation we were protecting Islam from criticism, for example, or whether we were introducing a new form of blasphemy law that was privileging Muslims. That debate was really live. It was really heated at that time. And I recognise now in reading about the evangelical micro-public sphere that there were actors that were involved at that time that came from it from a very particular Christian perspective of why it is that they felt threatened by this piece of legislation. And I think presently that we see aspects of this tension now present in debates about Islamophobia and whether or not there should be a move to adopt a definition of Islamophobia. So the micro-public sphere doesn't remain micro. There are spaces and there are contexts in which the micro and the macro conflate, and when the micro becomes really important in the macro-public sphere. So the micro-public sphere is not merely discursive. It's discussed quite a lot in Richard's book in relation to discursiveness, the conversations within. But from a Muslim perspective, I would say that this discursive debate also has practical and public implications, and it's really important to have a lens on some of that. I've got about a minute, so I'm going to skip a little bit and go down to the bottom and say that when thinking of motivations for engaging in micro-public spheres, and when thinking about expressing faith in the public sphere so that the micro-public sphere becomes an auxiliary space to what we want to see manifest in the public sphere, is dialogue without conversion success or failure? If engaging in the evangelical micro-public sphere, your motivation is to invite people to God, to invite people to a Christian way of living, a Christian way of understanding, where dialogue occurs and that is not the outcome, is participation in that microsphere success or failure? And I think it matters both for Muslims and for Christians, because both our faiths are proselytizing faiths. There is at the heart of the faith a call to invite others to the way of God. But do we run the risk of instrumentalizing dialogue if we speak of our participation in that public sphere only in terms of the numbers of recruits that we win from the other side? And I worry about that. I worry about it for Christian-Muslim relations, but I also worry about the authenticity with which we engage in dialogue itself. And I'll end with a final point about Pew Research conducted in 2018 in a report about being Christian in Western Europe, where there were lots of different questions asked about Christian practice, Christian belief, Christian attitudes, and a whole range of socio-political issues. But one of the things that came across in that particular report, which I found quite fascinating, was that people who were church-attending Christians and those who were non-practicing Christians tended to have were more likely to exude negative views of Muslims than people who had no religious affiliation whatsoever. And the question that really provoked for me is that when we as religions talk about God, when we talk about God-centered lives, when we talk about living God consciously, how we came to a space where, at a time when wider Europe is secularizing, as people of faith, we're not able always to talk politely or kindly to one another.
Thank you so much. Our last speaker is on home turf, Dr Andrew Atherstone, who's tutor in history and doctrine here at Wycliffe Hall. So
Hi everyone. Again, just a few minutes from my perspective, reading this book, and let me add my congratulations. Really excellent monograph. Super piece of work, helping us understand, I think, evangelicalism better, as well as evangelical Islam relations, but the evangelical community itself. Richard argues that there's been this big surge, this big peak of interest amongst evangelicals in Islam over the last 20 years, 23 years, in fact, since September 2011, 9/11, and suddenly evangelicals in the world sitting up and paying attention to what is happening out there within Islam in terms of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and in national identities and global missions and all of those sorts of things. And this book really is a testament to that surge of interest over the last 20 years. This huge variety of sources, of personalities, of contexts that you've been analysing for us. No one's done this before, bringing it from a global perspective, all together under one set of covers. And what comes over to me loud and clear is the massive diversity of evangelicalism in every sort of way. And Richard's shifting us from simple binaries to lived realities and the sheer complexity of what we're seeing amongst us. I guess if we were to draw the historical lens out more widely, we'd see similar surges and peaks of evangelical interest and engagement with Islam at previous points of history, previous points of crisis perhaps. Think of the OPEC oil crisis, do you remember that? Back in the mid-1970s, and a lot of the Arab nations embargoing oil exports to the US. Major global crisis, and evangelicals sitting up and thinking, we need to pay attention here to what's happening in the Middle East and other parts of the world. Or going back in time, you think of the great surge of interest amongst evangelical Christians at the end of the First World War, and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and this reading of biblical prophecy, or even further back than that, you can keep on going. Think of the Treaty of Paris, 1856, and after the Crimean War, and Turkey being integrated into political realities in Europe. A very long, a very rich, colourful, distressing, diverse history of evangelical Christian engagement with Islam. And I think what jumps out to me from Richard's book is the fact that this is now becoming a marker of evangelical identity. Perhaps we might want to say one of the key markers of how evangelicals describe themselves, or how you can begin to categorise the sort of evangelical you're talking to. One of the things you'd normally want to ask an evangelical to find out what sort of evangelical they are. You might want to ask them about their attitude to the Bible, or their attitude to the Holy Spirit, or their attitude to conversion. This book's suggesting to us, actually ask them about their attitude to Islam, and a whole bunch of other things begin to fit into place about where they are within this diverse evangelical movement. Yeah, a key marker of identity. Similar in some ways to 200 years ago, or even 100 years ago, attitudes to Roman Catholicism was a key marker of evangelical identity. The rise of anti-Catholicism, and how lively that was as part of your evangelical makeup is now sort of paralleled by your attitude to Islam. Friend or foe, collaborators, competitors, really deep in the evangelical psyche. Just as we've been sitting here this evening, I received an email from an evangelical Christian pastor, and it's entitled Farage and Islam. I'll just read you the first two sentences. Nigel Farage's otherwise commendable agenda, probably not 5 words you want to begin an email with. Nigel Farage's otherwise commendable agenda needs tightening up on Islam. The immigration threat is religious at root and not just political. And so it goes on to do with the general election. Exactly the sort of message you might have received 200 years ago from an evangelical Christian pastor in terms of the threat of Roman Catholicism, with this mass immigration from Ireland into Britain, changing the nature and the makeup of our communities. Great alarm about that. Probably not by an email, but some sort of Hanoverian tract or other would have arrived. And one of Richard's concluding chapters, chapter 14, offers us this taxonomy of evangelical responses, this kind of spectrum of evangelical approaches, what he calls a diagnostic tool for understanding evangelicalism. And we move from the unengaged, uninformed evangelical reactionary through to the engaged, informed evangelical pragmatist or the evangelical progressive, and then the unengaged evangelical idealist, or even worse, the unengaged, uninformed, fearful evangelical, and lots of other categories in between. What Richard doesn't tell us, at least explicitly, I think is the best place to be on that spectrum, but we can guess probably it's somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle, the engaged evangelical, the informed evangelical. And that's one of the reasons I want to commend this book, because it's helping us in that project. It's actually helping the evangelical community to understand itself better and to be more self-aware and more self-informed, as well as then engaging with the Muslim communities. That's why I'm really hoping this will be read not just in the academy, but we need it in paperback, so it can be read in the evangelical churches as well. Better engaged, better informed, more self-reflective. And that tradition runs right through this institution that we're sitting in today at Wycliffe Hall. And you'll have seen the study week that some students here are involved in this week, which Richard is organising, helping us to be better engaged and better informed and deeper thinkers. Really striking that right at the central section of this book is entitled Evangelicals Talking Among Themselves, which is, in fact, most of the book, the central big section. And I take it that title is intended not only as a description of what's happening, but also perhaps as something of an authorial rebuke. Evangelicals talking amongst themselves. But the study week that's being organised is not just talking amongst themselves, but going, and there was a visit to a synagogue this morning down in Jericho. There's a visit to a mosque tomorrow, imams and other speakers coming in. And again, if we were to just widen the lens a little bit, you'll notice that in this place, that's been something of our story in fits and starts. And I think it's kind of started again over the last 10 years or so. Richard's work and Ida Glazer's work here as well. But 100 years ago, amongst the students, the evangelicals here were asking the same question. How can we not just talk amongst ourselves, but go out and do this engaging? There were no, I don't think, any mosques in Oxford in 1920 to go and visit. So they decided, en masse, en bloc, to take the entire college to the Middle East one summer vacation. For 9 weeks, principal and vice principal and all the students, and travelled by train down to Marseille, and then got a boat across the Mediterranean to Alexandria, 2 days in Cairo, and early encounters for many of these evangelical ordinands training for Church of England parish ministry, the first time they'd ever encountered Islamic culture, Islamic architecture, Islamic thinkers. They visited mosques, they witnessed a Muslim procession of pilgrims returning from Mecca, and then on to Jaffa and Jerusalem for deeper engagement. Not evangelicals talking amongst themselves, but talking with others, trying to listen and learn. And such an impression upon this institution that it was repeated every 2 years, all the way up until the Second World War made it more difficult. One more minute, yes. Visiting the Sultan Hassan Mosque, visiting the Muhammad Ali Alabaster Mosque, viewing early manuscripts of the Quran in Egypt's National Library, touring the Al-Azhar University, the ancient centre of Islamic scholarship, getting permission from the Grand Mufti for these Wycliffe evangelical Oxford Anglicans to enter the Haram-es Sharif, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They drank tea on the roof of the mosque at Nabi Samuel with permission of the local sheikh, now part of the West Bank, of course. Remarkable examples of evangelical Muslim interaction, seeking to be better informed and better engaged. Richard, therefore, is standing in an honourable tradition. We're so grateful that you are helping us here in this institution to do this better, to carry that on, that we might not just be talking amongst ourselves, but talking with others, listening and learning together. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We're struggling for time slightly, but have we got a few minutes for questions?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, and then I should have said we can break and you can interrogate one or more speakers over drinks and snacks if you wish. But yeah, if you have a question, I'll spot you, and then if you want to direct it to a particular individual, do make that clear. Oh, Danny.
I'll start off. I read the book Edward Said, Orientalism, and the vision of the Orientalism is that we created Islam for our own purposes, and therefore we distorted it and made this Oriental world that didn't exist, that affirmed us in who we are. And I just wonder from your research, I don't know if I'm asking you, Richard, or I'm asking the panel, but has that, do you feel you've got a sense of that actually we've distorted what Islam really is? Because it's convenient for us, do you know what I mean? We're so much wanting to maybe find Jesus and everything, whatever it is, that we have to make it this way, and therefore we never actually see it as it is. So have you found that out?
Sure, great points. So have we created our own vision or version of what Islam is? And I talk quite a bit about essentialism in one of the chapters, the things that as outsiders we actually say really true Islam is, and it's because we've looked at the text, we've looked at the history and the traditions, and so we make this idea of an essential Islam or an essential Muslim in a very unhelpful way, because in actual fact Muslims and Islam are very diverse. So I try to stress that. Having said that, this word Orientalism in another chapter, I also just raised the question whether it's a little bit of a trump card that's sometimes played if you ask a difficult question about a text or about history or tradition. There can be the accusation that's Orientalism, asking that sort of question, and it's sometimes I've come across is used to shut down discussion, which I think can actually be unhelpful.
Someone else? Anyone else with a question? If not, that's allowed.
Do you see the scene within evangelicalism shifting in any particular direction? Is it getting more informed, or are the theological institutions like this failing in helping people to do that?
Well, excellent question about theological institutions, because in another piece of research I actually found that our theological institutions are doing less teaching on Islam, including it less in their programmes, because of the pressure on the curriculum often, and because of financial pressure. So 20 years ago we had more specialists teaching in Christian institutions, specialists in Islam, but also in faiths more generally than we do today, which I think is shocking. I do think that evangelicals have shifted in their thinking. I think whereas if you went back 40 years, very, very few evangelicals would get involved in any sort of interfaith at all. It was seen as being the preserve of the World Council of Churches. It was probably very ecumenical and a bit iffy, not somewhere where an evangelical would want to be seen. But once you get to the end of the 90s and into the noughties, all of a sudden evangelicals in this country, through something called Faith and Society, but then in the USA, particularly through a Common Word, which was an initiative from 138 Muslim scholars, a letter to the Pope and lots of other Christian leaders, that drew evangelicals in. And I think there's been a lot more thinking and discussion. Doesn't mean to say, though, that it hasn't actually become more polarised. Which was the object lesson of the WhatsApp group that I was part of, which is polarising more and getting sort of more contentious.
Thank you very much, Richard. This is very engaging. All the presenters really interesting discussion you have generated. So God bless you for that. Just along the line with the last question, it's very general in this evangelical response, regardless of geographic differences, because that response could depend on how Islam is perceived or how Islamic forces are acting in different geographical settings. Have you looked at, for example, evangelicals in Africa, evangelicals in Asia and Europe and Latin America, how they differ in their responses to Islam?
Yeah, so I do try to make this more of a global overview. I have to confess that it's not exhaustively global. So my African examples are mainly from West Africa, which is a particular context where there's particular tensions certainly in Nigeria and Burkina Faso and so on. So there are writers from that context, but writing in both directions. There are some who are writing in more conciliatory ways, even though they're in a very hostile context. And then, particularly the Middle East, I've drawn on quite a lot of Middle Eastern writers, both from Christian background communities in the Middle East, and also just a few who have converted as well, as Shenaz was talking about. Nobody from Ethiopia, sorry. Right, we probably do need to stop there, even though the Reverend Bruce Gillingham's got his hand up. Well, Bruce, go on. Just a very short question, yeah.
Short answer. How do we move from information to engagement?
Good question. How do we move from information to engagement? I think, Shenaz, did you just mention the church twinning project, or was that earlier when you were speaking? That was the earlier session. So Christian Muslim Forum actually runs something called church mosque twinning. So there's an interesting idea for you. Ask Shenaz more. I think that any context that we can find to be talking together with Muslims or Christians, depending which background we're coming from, is to be encouraged, and to do that in natural ways as well. And part of what I try and do in the ISW, or the course I'm teaching this week, is to make it a little bit more natural to approach somebody from the other community, to remove some of the fear of that. But I suspect that Martin's going to give you some more examples. In concluding, I will just say thank you ever so much for being here. Thank you ever so much to my speakers, especially to Grace and Shenaz, for travelling large distances to be here. I really do appreciate your support and the time that you've taken to read the book and to comment on it. And thank you, Andrew, as well. And just to say again, if you missed it at the beginning, that there is a discount code. There are flyers on the table. There aren't copies of this to buy for me to sign tonight, I'm afraid. It is still quite pricey, but you can use that discount code when you go on the Bloomsbury website to order it either as hardback or ebook. Give it a few months, it will come out in paperback. I don't know, can you lobby publishers to get them to publish it in paperback? Because there are just so many people that want to buy it.
They have different prices, don't they?
Yeah. Start bombarding Bloomsbury with emails saying, we want this in paperback now. So anyway, thank you very much.
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm fulfilling your brief of more examples of engagement, but just to say, yes, there are other books and information about the Centre on the table there, and I'm waving this piece because we actually have another event at the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies tomorrow evening, so I'll just take 30 seconds on this and then you can have a drink. Shabir Akhtar and the Bible. Some of you will know the late Shabir Akhtar. We paid him at the Centre to write a book about Paul's letter to the Galatians from the New Testament. Which he did at quite a serious level as a Muslim. That doesn't mean that he agreed with Paul, but it's an interesting exploration which engages closely with the Greek text of the letter as well. Sadly, Shabir collapsed and died on Cowley Road last July. So this is a 2-hour panel discussion with various speakers, Christian and Muslim, probing and appreciative. So if you're available, that's hybrid. There's information there. I'll put this out. You can join remotely or you can come along and see us. We don't always have 2 things in 2 days, but this is the season. So I think that's everything, Richard, unless you can think of anything I've forgotten. So please do feel free to stay and drink and ask more probing questions. Thank you very much.